Order the meeting of the Committee of the Whole on June 26, 2024 at 7:01 p.m. First item of business is the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand. Next item is a roll call.
Alder Allen is delayed. Mayor Arata Frada. Here. Alder Dantzler Jr.
Here.
Alder Gerhardt.
Here.
Alder Herbst.
Here.
Alder Jetzer.
Here.
Alder Maldonado.
Here.
Alder Vafadari.
Here.
And Alder Wheeler.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Wonderful. Next item of business is the approval of minutes, and I'll take a motion on the May 22nd, 2024 Committee of the Whole minutes.
So moved. Second.
Approval moved by Alder Dantzler. Any questions, comments, changes? Seeing none, all in favor of the draft minutes say aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
Aye.
I'll take that as a yes. I'll pause next time. Motion carries. Moving on to item 5, public appearances for non-agenda items. There's nobody in chambers and nobody online, so we can move on to item 6, agenda items. 6A, financial management plan. This is from Misty Dodge and Ellers. Oh, we're going to go right to Ellers. Greg, do you want to take it away?
Yes, I will take it away. Good evening. I'm going to share my screen to share our presentation here this evening. With me this evening is my colleague, Kayla Thorpe. She'll be co-presenting with me, so we'll be going through the financial management plan. Just to start with some background information in terms of kind of what we typically try to accomplish through the financial management plan. The city goes through this efforts annually each year around this time, kind of use it as a preview in terms of long-term financial trends and impacts that we're seeing from a budgetary perspective as you start to plan and look ahead for your 2025 budget and beyond. Typically in this presentation, we incorporate the mayor's capital improvement program into this model, and so we'll be speaking to that as well. So we'll start by going through some of the basic financial metrics that we typically monitor for the city that are tied back to specific financial policies. Really, the benefit of this model is that it looks at a long-range levy forecast and incorporates all of your levy-supported funds, which includes the general fund, transit, library fund, capital projects, and debt service. And it provides that framework not only for the 2025 budget, but kind of looks at beyond at longer trends. And then we'll discuss, as we have in previous years, the context of levy limits and how that impacts the city's budget in the near term and long term. So with that as kind of an introduction in terms of what we're going to accomplish and discuss this evening, I'm going to turn it over to Kayla to walk through some of the city's existing financial policies and your credit profile.
Thanks, Greg. As you all are probably well aware, the city received a upgrade in their financial credit rating from Moody's just a few weeks ago, in relation to the most recent debt issue. And a few things that were pointed out as credit strengths of this city was the liquidity ratio, which really measures the fund balance and cash on hand that the city has the ability to access kind of in that doomsday situation if we needed to access cash on hand to pay any liabilities of the city, as well as economic metrics that the city has of per capita income, housing metrics, all of those kind of things that Moody's looks at of the ability of the tax base to support the city operations. And then both the long-term liabilities and fixed cost ratios remain relatively low in relation to the ability of the tax base to continue to pay taxes and support those city operations. I'm sure you all are well aware that you have a number of financial policies that dictate kind of how you will operate in the financial picture of creating your levy and maintaining a certain amount of fund balances, debt service balances, and kind of how you will take on new debt and take a look at capital planning moving in the short and long term. And we're going to kind of take a look at those and where you are in the context of today and what you have on the book today, and kind of how that our financial management plan looks at that moving into the future. Your general fund unassigned fund balance policy states that you should have no more than 15 to 25% of your unassigned fund balance as accounted for as your revenues. And this graph is showing kind of your all-in fund balance designations. And so your designated fund balances are unassigned, assigned, non-spendable, and restricted. And you'll see those kind of broken out in your financial statements at the kind of that all-in chart. But you'll see you've had some fluctuations in fund balances throughout the years, but still maintaining within your policy. And as of your year-end 2023, we're really at the top of your revenue policy of 25.09%. There was a decline in 27 and 2018 to how you assigned future retirement benefits and pilot payments from utilities. And it's important to note that expenditure restraint revenue is accounted for in the capital projects fund. But it's important to note that you continue to maintain fund balance policies. And this is something that Moody's looks at as a strong indicator as financial health moving into the future, because that maintains that liquidity and that future cash on hand moving forward if something were to happen. You also have a policy about how you are going to take on and pay for and take a look at debt as a percentage of your operating budget. And you take that, and the city has a policy that 15 to 25% of the entire general operating fund, library, and debt service fund will be general obligation debt. And this is just kind of a graphical representation of that. It kind of puts it better into graphs than the numbers just on a chart, showing that you are well within that policy, and it has maintained relatively stable and is planned to maintain stable throughout the life of our financial management plan and into the future, given the current capital improvement plan that the mayor has laid out. There's also a debt service tax rate policy and a GO debt capacity policy. Debt service tax rate policy is not to exceed $2.25 per thousand. This policy, or the plan that is outlined for you today through 25 through 2034 is 92 cents per thousand. In the 2023 plan, the average was 88 cents per thousand. So we are adding some capital projects that is going to drive that debt service tax levy up a little bit, but still well within the threshold set under your debt tax rate policy. And then your GO debt capacity policy notes that you'll not exceed 60% of your GO debt capacity limit under state statute. State statute notes that you can't have more than 5% of your total equalized value of debt outstanding at any one point in time. And your policy states that you'll stay at 60% of that. The maximum utilization under the current plan is 27%. That is down from 35% presented at this time last year. And we just want to kind of show you what that equalized value projection is on a TID out basis. And this is what is kind of goes into calculating what that 5% equalized value or GO debt capacity will be. We take an ultra conservative approach in projecting out, and it's a 4 or a 5-year look back of equalized value on an economic change and a net new construction basis. And then we discount that by 50%. So we see that you've had a 9.32% change in economic change and a 4.44% net new construction average over the prior 4 years. And so applying that moving forward, we're going to take a 4.66 average and a 2.22 average and kind of project that out. We've also factored in the TID 15 closure and bringing that value online now in a TID out basis. And that will help us determine not only what those new equalized values will be, but what your GO debt capacity will be. And then building that into what the new debt will be built in part of the plan, and what the debt limit policy, where we stand in the debt limit policy will be. And I think I go back to Greg right now.
So next, we're going to kind of talk about the operational model and in terms of how we're kind of forecasting the future operational costs. And this is really based off of existing services. So we work with BISD to kind of develop the operational model to kind of look at trends. And so, most of your non-levy revenue sources typically don't change much year over year. That's very consistent with what we see in Wisconsin communities throughout the state. We have forecasted some increases in some of your intergovernmental aids, your road aid increases, going forward. And then there's the potential that some of your shared revenue payments could increase going forward under the budget bill that was passed last year. That is tied to sales tax increases at the state level. That could increase by as much as 2% per year. But then some of your recreational charges are increasing to kind of mirror expense increases to keep those charges for services to match in line with the expense of providing that service. And then your internal administrative charges between your utilities and library is increasing at about 5% per year. So intended to be kind of a conservative look in terms of how your costs are increasing going forward, but kind of breaking down kind of how we forecast that operational forecast for your general fund on the revenue side. On the expense side, most of your wage-driven departments, the expenditures are increasing by about 5% per year. Other expenditures are increasing in a range of 3% to 4% per year. The model does include some allowances added for staffing to reflect the operating impact of the capital improvement plan. So those are estimates. Those will be updated as more information becomes available and specific projects are implemented. But that's typically kind of an allowance that we've included in our forecasting model to account for the operational impact of the capital improvement plan. So taking all of that into account and kind of looking at your overall revenue picture for the general fund. So we have your revenue categories that are kind of broken down by your typical chart of accounts. So we list your property taxes, your intergovernmental revenues, licenses and permits, public charges for service. And then on the expenditure side, we've just grouped everything by general government, public safety, public works, health and human services, cultural recreation, conservation and development. So again, your budget's certainly driven by line items, but we're really trying to focus here on long-term trends as we do the financial management plan. But want to emphasize that this is really focusing on existing services. So you see that your projected change in expenditures just for existing services kind of ranges between 4 and a little over about 5.5% throughout the forecast period of the model. So again, kind of showing how as costs increase, property tax levy is adjusted to cover those costs along with your non-levy revenue sources. In terms of your library fund, this model kind of impacts how levy increases are tied to the projected net due construction that drives under levy limits, how much you can increase your operational levy each year. We'll talk more about levy limits in a moment. But expenditures are projected to kind of outpace that allowable levy increase. So you're seeing kind of a deficit by 2029. These expenditures do not consider capital projects that would be funded by equipment replacement funds that are set aside for capital acquisition related to the library. So, similarly, as we're seeing with the city overall, as, costs continue to increase, and you have, levy limits, those pressures are starting to kind of create some gaps going forward. So this chart just kind of shows how that impacts the library specifically. In terms of the transit fund, that's funded by a combination of property taxes and non-levy revenue sources. Presently, the fund balance in that fund at the end of 2023, the beginning of this fiscal year, was approximately $130,000. So we're just showing how that budget would remain balanced going forward to kind of cover operational costs using a similar forecast methodology to what we use for the general fund and what we use for the library. So really the intent of kind of forecasting the operational funds is to see how that's going to impact your overall levy when we factor in operations, capital, and debt. And that's really what we're going to be spending our time focusing on this evening, is really that integrated model that looks at your overall tax levy going forward. But let's transition into debt service. And this is where we'll start talking about kind of the updated capital improvement plan based on the mayor's CIP that was released a few weeks ago at the beginning of the month. But we'll begin by just looking at your existing general obligation debt service. And this does include the debt service for the debt issuance that was recently completed last month. So you'll see on the far left-hand side of this chart that your gross principal and interest payments that you make annually for your debt service. And then the city typically budgets several non-levy revenue sources to have those revenue sources pay for their proportional share of debt. So there's debt outstanding for TID 9, TID 10, and TID 13. So all those TID districts pay their proportional share of debt. And then typically when the city sells debt, there's often a premium bid. We had that with the notes that were sold last month. A portion of that gets deposited into the debt service fund. It can be used to repay interest expense. And then the city has budgeted some impact fee revenue for fire impact fees to help cover debt service related to prior debt that was issued for fire station improvements. So the box that's kind of highlighted the net tax levy, that kind of shows your existing levy for debt service before we look at the impact of future debt issuance to fund the capital improvement plan. So in terms of the CIP, at least those projects that are identified to be funded through the issuance of general obligation debt, your CIP identifies numerous revenue sources that pay for capital projects. Portion are funded through an annual capital tax levy. You have other, revenue sources that you designate for capital projects, expenditure restraint. You've had some TID closure dollars that are earmarked for capital. You have some utility funds that are earmarked for capital. So your CIP does an excellent job of laying all those funding sources out. So on the chart on the next page, we're going to focus on those projects that are going to be funded by debt. In the 2023 CIP for years 25 through 2032, there was approximately 28 million of project costs identified. In the 24 CIP in that same period of time, it's about 88 million of capital projects identified. So we'll look at how that impacts the debt service levy going forward. But that's kind of the change in that planning period from last year to this year for those projects financed with debt. So on this chart, we've listed all of the projects that are identified in your capital improvement plan that are intended to be funded by general obligation debt. So we list the project in the first column, and then the project ID ties back to your capital planning software. So each project has an ID number. Then the repayment identifies two pieces of information. First is what is the revenue source that's going to be applied to repay the debt service. So in many instances, that is going to be repaid by your property tax levy. Then we also have some projects that are identified specifically for TIP districts. Then there's some sewer projects that will be assessed. And then there are projects attributable to the stormwater utility that will be repaid by stormwater revenues. So you're looking at a combination of levy, utility, and TIP revenues to repay general obligation debt service. Then the next piece of information in that repayment column is how long the debt is going to be amortized. So if it's going to be amortized over 10 years or 20 years, and then there are specific years identified for some of the TIP districts. That identifies the final year of increment collection for the TID. So we are amortizing the debt within the remaining increment collection period of those TIP districts. And then some of the projects that are related to the sewer utility that'll be assessed, and the stormwater utility, those are amortized over 10 years. So you'll see that this project list goes out from 2025 all the way out through 2034. We're looking at over that period of time, about 96.6 million of project costs. So as you all are very familiar with, every year the city updates its capital improvement plan. So we know that this is subject to future changes and revisions. But every year at this time, we take that current version of the CIP and update our long-range financing model so you can see the impact financially both on operations and debt service. So to that end, looking at, the impact of all of those projects, shown on the previous slide, if all of those were financed, this is how that debt service levy would change going forward. So we show your existing debt service levy on the far left-hand side. That's your existing levy in place for existing debt. Then we show the gross principal and interest for debt issues from 2025 through 2034. And then the abatement column, that represents the TIF revenues, the stormwater utility revenues, sewer assessments that would be budgeted to pay their respective share of the debt service. And then we look at how your total net debt service levy would change and how that levy change for debt service would change year over year. So from 2024 to 2025, you're going to see the debt service levy increase by about $228,000. And then going forward, that levy increase is projected to be right around $500,000 per year. And that's to fully fund everything that was identified to be funded with general obligation debt, in all those years on the previous chart. So understanding everything on the list may not get funded, but this is always intended to be an all-in model that looks at all of the capital projects. So we structured the debt so that levy change each year for debt service would be relatively consistent for budgetary planning purposes. So that $500,000 was kind of a consistent amount so that we know kind of how that would change based on the CIP. So we've identified issues all the way out through 2034. That's when our planning model ends. Next year, if you issue debt in 2035, when we update the model for another year, that would hit the debt service levy in 2036. So you'll see we've kind of built in a decrease in the debt service levy in 2036. That's to account for kind of the end of our debt planning model, which ends in 2034. So the next year would be 2035. That would hit the levy in 2036. So we really have tried to kind of structure out over our planning period, but then leave for future debt issuance that we're not accounting for in this model. So in terms of your general obligation debt capacity, we kind of, I just realized I duplicated the chart from the previous page. So give me 1 minute and I will correct that, and I'll bring up the correct projection. So my apologies. I will bring that up. Okay, so here's kind of the chart that kind of shows your general obligation debt capacity projection. So this looks at all your existing general obligation debt and then all of your future debt from 2025 all the way out through our planning model in 2034. So you'll see that, through that planning model, you're at about 20% of your debt limit now projected to be at that level by the end of fiscal year 2024, and kind of through the planning period, kind of the highest utilization that you get to is at about 27%. So in terms of your overall debt burden and your borrowing capacity, these are very reasonable ranges. When we had your rating call with Moody's last month and we kind of presented the long range financial plan, they're aware of kind of your future debt issuance. And so, really seeing that debt burden not get much higher than 27%, is something that they're kind of, going to deem reasonable based off of planned capital investment. So it's, this is where, the long range planning that we do every year kind of pays dividends with your rating because we can show this to Moody's every time you go into the debt market. They can see that you're not only planning for operations, but you're also planning for capital. So, they're aware of this future debt issuance, but, in terms of your debt limit, that shouldn't have any negative implications on your credit rating. It is more about, affordability at the end of the day.
Question, Greg.
Yes.
So you were showing like 20%, but on the previous slide, it looked like it was hovering at around $1 per thousand assessed value. So is this 20%? This is 20% of the state imposed limit, or 20% of our policy limit? Because I thought our policy was like 2.25.
It's of the state imposed limit. So
Okay.
under state statute, your borrowing limit, the amount of principal that you can have outstanding on a general obligation basis cannot exceed 5% of your total equalized value. So in 2024, your legal debt limit is 305 million. So we're projecting at the end of 2024, you'll have about total about 60, almost 61 million of debt outstanding. That's about 20% of your limit. So you've got 244 million of borrowing capacity remaining based on the state limitation.
Okay. So where that says 20%, it's more like 40% of our policy limit then?
Correct.
Okay.
So really, from a legal perspective, your borrowing limit isn't really a constraint legally. It's more of, we're certainly not recommending you would borrow anywhere close to your legal limit. But we always like to look at that, in terms of that you've got more than adequate capacity remaining to kind of to fund projects. It's really more about affordability and the tax rate implication.
Yeah. Thanks for the clarification.
Sure, you're welcome. And I'll swap out that chart. My apologies, I didn't catch that. So in terms of the multi-year budget forecast, this includes all aspects of your budget that we've been discussing up until this point. So your primary operational funds, which is the general fund, library, transit, and then your capital outlay fund. And then we've got your existing debt service and your proposed debt service, all aspects of your levy. And so again, includes your entire capital improvement plan, all projects identified to be borrowed. Some of your debt is supported again by non-levy revenue sources, utility revenues, and stormwater and sewer revenues and TID revenues. And so it illustrates the impact of those long-term debt issuance projects as well. So here we kind of show kind of the first several years of the plan. So we kind of show historically several years kind of where your total levy has been and where your tax rate is on an equalized basis. And then we calculate the city share of a tax bill for a home with a value of $330,000. So that's kind of shown here at the bottom of the chart. So 2021 through 2024 are really kind of actual tax rate calculations and the fiscal impact, and then 25 through 27 is a projection. So you'll see that your tax rate has kind of fluctuated over the years as you've seen increases in your equalized value. For budget year 2023 and budget year 2024, you saw some substantial increases in your TID out equalized value. That is due to TID closures. So you close some of the city's longer standing and larger value TID districts. And so you saw significant increases in your tax value, and that corresponded to changes in your tax rate. So you'll see that, those notable declines in your tax rate per thousand as that incremental value increased. So that's really the benefit of a TIP district. Once that incremental value goes back onto the tax rolls, you have a larger tax base to spread your levy, which impacts your tax rate. That impacts not only the city, but all the taxing jurisdictions, county, school district, and technical college as well.
I have a quick
So
question.
kind of continuing. Sure.
Sorry. So I'm trying to wrap my brain around the annual city taxes on that 330 value. Because I know in this past year, for example, or when the school district, when we ran our referendum, we got many calls from Fitchburg residents complaining that they were like, you said you wouldn't raise our taxes. And we were like, we didn't raise your taxes. And what they were seeing was an increase in their Fitchburg taxes. And so I'm kind of confused as to how this number is going down. Yeah, can somebody explain to me are we saying that the average home paid less in taxes this year than they did last year?
Yes. That's true.
Okay, so I guess the cause I was getting was
for the city portion of the tax bill. I think that's kind of the distinction. We're not in this chart representing the taxes that same 330,000 valued home would have paid to the respective school district where that property is located, the county, and the technical college.
Okay.
Yeah, if Misty can jump in and talk about it, please.
Yeah, I'll just confirm. So yes, the city's portion of the tax bill went down a little bit or was basically the same. For the most part, it was the other overlying jurisdictions that caused the increases in the tax bill, including the Verona School District. That was partially because of the shift in the equalized values between all the different communities that the school district serves. So there was
I was about to say, we didn't change
fluctuation.
our mill rate, so I'm not computing how that happened, but it was the equalized values changing.
Right,
that
and so
made it
the
happen.
mill rate overall may not have changed, but the shift between the different communities happened. And the mill rate that often is used by the school district is the equalized value mill rate, which does increase based on market value. So there's some nuances in that calculation.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have another
Yes,
question.
Misty's correct.
Why we are using a $330,000 value for a home when, the average home value is more than that?
So that is the average home value as of last year, was the $330,000, or maybe 2 years ago.
As what it was as 2023?
Could be. I'd have to go back and look at the document.
I'm guessing it might be 22 or 21, based upon, I think it was we've been using 381, I think it is, for referendum planning purposes.
Yeah, this is what I am confused.
Yeah.
So we are using, even for 2025, 26, and 27, we are using 330. Okay.
Yeah, it uses the same value. So again, it's to determine the impact on any valued home. Take 380,000. Take 380,000 times 5.66. For example, in 2025, divided by 1,000, that's going to be the amount of taxes that particular home pays. So we just kind of use a value. We can certainly use different values, but that's why we show the tax rate per thousand. So you can literally calculate the taxes on any valued home that you want to use.
You can continue, Greg.
Okay. So we just kind of continue the model here going forward from 2028 through 2034. Again, shows what that equalized tax rate is per thousand, just based on, the city's tax rate. And we're kind of looking at, again, as Kayla mentioned, kind of, conservative growth in equalized value at about 6.88% per year, which is, more conservative than what we've been seeing over your 5-year trend. But we typically like to build in more conservative assumptions, particularly the longer we go out in the model. A 10-year forecast is a pretty long forecast, to kind of project all these different variables that go into your budget, but just kind of shows how things are changing year over year. In terms of how your tax levy then is kind of distributed to kind of fund, the various aspects of your budget, it's really very consistent year over year in the model. So the majority of your levy goes to fund your general fund, your primary operational fund. Next is kind of a combination of your existing debt and your proposed debt. And then we have kind of capital projects, and then transit is kind of the smallest aspect of your levy. So really year over year, these percentages aren't projected to change all that significantly. It just kind of shows where that tax levy dollar goes within all the levy aspects, components of your budget. So to kind of summarize the financial model before we kind of get into some of the long-term trends. So the average annual total levy increase from the 2024 budget to the 2034 budget is about a 5.5% average annual increase year over year. And again, that incorporates all your operational funds, capital, and debt service. In terms of your financial policy targets that Kayla mentioned, you're in compliance with your total debt expense, your tax rate for debt service, and your internal debt capacity policies. So if the full capital improvement plan was funded, you're still below those not to exceed amounts in your policies. But as we're going to talk about, and isn't really new, to Fitchburg or we're seeing this, pretty regularly across the state. We're starting to see ongoing levy limit pressures. So we're going to kind of get into that next to kind of go into the particulars of levy limit management under the state requirements. So we've been talking about all the various levy funded aspects of your budget. They are all subject to levy limits with the exception of debt service. General obligation debt service levy is exempt from levy limits. So, your general, library, transit, and capital all have to fit under that allowable levy as prescribed in the levy limit statutes. So what that allowable levy is that you cannot increase your levy by more than the percentage increase due to net new construction in the preceding year, or zero if there is none. And then there are numerous adjustments that the city can determine on an annual basis if they qualify to also increase your levy above that net new construction amount. The one adjustment that the city claims routinely every year is your allowable increase in the levy to cover your general obligation debt service. So that's, one levy adjustment that the city always claims. Other adjustments, are dependent on whether or not the city qualifies in a given year. So, when we look at how the city has managed levy limits going forward, it's been a combination of a lot of different strategies. So this is not an exhaustive list, but kind of highlights in the near term how the city's been able to kind of navigate levy limits up until this point. So first is just what the city does normally through its budget process and throughout the year. It's just prioritization of capital projects and your existing services, trying to, balance fiscal constraints with maintaining services and providing services that your residents and businesses have come to expect. We talked about how the TIC closures have helped your tax rate decrease over the past couple of years as that large incremental value returned to the tax roll. It also had a one-time levy limit benefit the year following that TIC closure. Under the levy limit law, when a TIC closes, you get a one-time levy limit increase that following year, which allows you to partially increase your allowable levy based on the incremental value that's been generated in that district. So the city has been taking advantage of that in those years where that was applicable. To the city's credit, they worked cooperatively with the city of Madison to work with the Department of Revenue to get some one-time levy limit adjustments to help increase the city's allowable levy to cover some costs related to increases upon the absorption of the town of Madison. So that was, some one-time adjustments that were coincided with the city seeing that increase in cost within its budget. And then finally, shared revenue this past year through the state budget was the first, one-time, or first initial, I should say, increase in shared revenue under the state budget in decades. A lot of that revenue was used and kind of, factored into your budget. So you could see some increases in shared revenue, as I mentioned earlier, based on, potentially 2% increase based on state sales tax growth. But really those revenues were kind of applied to cover increased costs for existing services. So this is, kind of some of the primary tools that the city's been using in recent years to kind of manage levy limits outside of just, ongoing good fiscal management. So last year when we made this same presentation, we spent, a considerable amount of time talking about some alternative revenue sources. We talked about levy limit referendums, and you've continued those discussions into this year. We talked about impact fees, which are specific charges that can be levied against new development to help pay for the cost of that new development. So, for example, we're working with the city on looking at an impact fee to cover a portion of the new proposed police station. So you can have a charge that is collected upon issuance of a building permit to help offset some of those capital costs, similar to what you have in place presently for fire station improvements. And then we looked at a variety of other revenue sources, streetlight user charges, the wheel tax that's administered through the State Department of Transportation. Last year at this time, we were talking about transportation utility districts, which were kind of an alternative revenue stream to help fund street improvements. Since we made this presentation last year, there's been rulings by the state Supreme Court that have really kind of made those, ill-advisable, not advisable under those rulings. And so, that's kind of been eliminated. And then we had a discussion about payment in lieu of taxes, which are payments that, properties that don't make property tax payment can make to help pay for city services. So this was kind of a menu, again, not an exhaustive list of all revenue sources, but kind of main ones that are available. And really, we were kind of focusing on the levy limit referendum because that gives you the most financial horsepower going forward, because that's your primary revenue source to fund your operations and capital and debt service. So kind of on that budget model that we developed and that we've been discussing here this evening, just based off of existing services, your projected levy limit gap is about $585,000. Now, what that doesn't take into account is a levy limit adjustment that the city's been taking advantage of the past couple of years, which was for increases in costs due to joint fire and EMS services. There are annually, you can qualify to increase your allowable levy if the total charges made by those joint departments do not increase by more than 2% plus a CPI factor over the previous year. It's not based on the city's increases in costs necessarily. You have to qualify based off of the total charges that those joint departments are providing, not only to Fitchburg, but other municipal entities that department services. And then if that qualifies, the city made a levy limit adjustment on their worksheet. So you took advantage of that for your 2024 budget, but you need to qualify for that annually. If you don't qualify one year, you could qualify the next. To be conservative, we've not factored that you would qualify for that levy limit adjustment for the 2025 budget. But that levy limit gap is just kind of projected to increase, going forward, as much to about 1.1 million within 5 years, in this particular model. So again, our net new construction percentages that we're using are relatively conservative. This is the summary of the levy limit worksheet that gets filed annually with the Department of Revenue. I'm not going to walk you through this because if you thought it's been boring up until this point, you're in for a surprise if we have to go through this. But we'll kind of talk about, how the key milestones in this worksheet. So I mentioned, you get one-time adjustments for TID districts upon TID closures. So for the 2024 budget, you got a one-time levy limit increase of about $697,000. Your net new construction increase in your levy for this fiscal year was about $884,000. So we're showing what that net new construction amount would be going forward based on 3% net new construction and then about 2% net new construction starting with fiscal year 2030. Really no TID closures kind of projected within this model as of yet. You are projected, the TID 15 closure will impact your 2025 budget. You'll see about a one-time levy increase of about $225,000 related to that. But even with that amount, we're still projecting that $485,000 gap. Again, as I mentioned, last year, you claimed about $129,739 one-time increase to your allowable levy for a joint fire and EMS. We're not projecting that, going forward. If the district qualifies, that could potentially reduce the levy limit gap. So typically when we presented this model, again, it's an all-in model, kind of assumes, everything gets funded as presented. The last several years we've been projecting for the upcoming fiscal year, there's been, a levy limit gap. And so the city goes through its annual budget process to look for ways to kind of, trim that gap. But as you've talked about, adding additional services and kind of expanding your offerings to the various packages that you've been talking about, your levy limit referendum, the primary reason that is needed is because you've been experiencing some financial gaps that you've had to address just for your existing services. So adding new services, by reason stands that you need to look for sustainable funding sources to fund those new services as well. So, kind of the levy limit gap that we're looking at here, hopefully conservative, but, we're not at a different point than we typically are when we look at this model, particularly the last couple of years, we've been seeing those fiscal pressures. And again, we're going on almost 20 years of levy limits. And so I think we're starting to kind of see the cumulative impact of that build up. We are seeing a significant uptick year over year in the number of communities that are starting to see operational levy limit referendums because they've kind of exhausted, their other budgetary strategies to fund, existing services or to expand services. So the fact that you're having those conversations, you're in good company. We're seeing that really increase significantly year over year. So the budget guidance, this kind of summarizes a lot of the points I was just kind of making up until this point. Typically when you go through your annual budget process, the city does an excellent job of taking all of these things into consideration, your tax levy and your tax rate, the impact on your taxpayers, certainly being mindful of that and the overall affordability, but really tying that back to service delivery, your existing services, any new services or changes in existing services or decreases if those are permitted as well. I think it's very easy when you're, kind of going through all these decisions to, lose sight of the fact that, this local government as a city, you're in the service delivery business. That is what you do. You provide all the great services that you provide to your residents and businesses, from public safety to public works to managing your growth going forward. It's, making sure your residents understand the value that they get for their tax dollars to provide those services. And, as you've looked at fleshing out various service packages with your levy limit referendum scenarios, that's precisely what you're doing. You're tying back those dollars that you're collecting to what that is going to fund and what your citizens and businesses are going to see with those dollars. Your CIP, very robust, looking out 10 years, trying to strike that balance between investing in day-to-day services, but infrastructure and other capital needs. We've talked about your debt service impacts. And then, the city has strategically used fund balance in acceptable ways, particularly for capital projects. So Kayla mentioned at the end of fiscal year 23, you're kind of right at your unassigned fund balance, right at kind of that maximum level of your policy at about 25%. We've had a lot of conversations with Moody's over the years. They know that you strategically use that fund balance to help support some capital investment, which they view as a strong use of fund balance. You're not using fund balance to pay for ongoing day-to-day services. That's generally frowned upon because that's not a sustainable revenue source to kind of pay for your services. So that's kind of the overview of the model. Again, kind of the intent here is to kind of look long term. You're certainly going to get into more of the details of your line item budgets as you get into your 2025 budget discussions. But I'll pause here, allow Misty or Chad to interject as they deem appropriate, and then Kayla and I are happy to answer questions or revisit any topics that we've addressed thus far.
I know we had a few questions along the way, but I'll give you all a few minutes to ponder that. Nicole?
After this, thank you for giving this presentation. For those of us who have not been through a city budget, it is a little overwhelming. Could we get these materials afterwards, please? Because I would really love to. I know they weren't in the agenda packet beforehand, which I would like to think I could have looked at, but probably couldn't have made heads or tails of without Ellers here presenting them. So if we could get them afterwards, I think that'd be great to kind of look at.
Yep. So we actually posted on the city's website under the finance page. So we'll get the
great.
updated slide from Greg probably tomorrow, and we'll get it posted
So
tomorrow.
it's there before this meeting too?
No, it was last
okay,
year's. It's out there now.
I was like,
And then-
man, I missed it. Okay,
Nope,
thank you.
Yep.
Just generally speaking, it's really good to talk through the levy limit the projections to kind of see the gap that's coming, and also what we've done to avoid it to date, because the city's done a really good job and has been much more successful than other surrounding municipalities at managing our levy limit, in part because we had such great net new construction for so many years, but also because the financial policies have been, and the financial strategies were working well. But it's an important context. I appreciate the diving into the levy limits and how that affects our budget. So thanks for that information, Greg. Any other, Bill?
You're welcome.
Yeah, I think a few slides back, you showed what I thought was average annual levy increase over the next 10 years, and you had it at like 5.5%, which seemed very high. Could you go back and explain that for me, please?
Sure. I will do that and just kind of pull that up here again. Get to that.
We're in good shape.
Yeah, so here was kind of the slide that we kind of pulled up that kind of looked at, kind of that average total levy increase from the 2024 budget to the 2034 budget. Just kind of looking at that total levy. And so what that's kind of derived from is kind of going back is just kind of looking at that annual change, kind of in the levy kind of year over year. So as we're kind of looking at that, this is kind of what we're averaging out. So from 2028 through 2034, you can kind of see year over year kind of how that levy changes. And then we go back, kind of some historical years, and then from 2025 going forward. So that's what we're averaging out, is just kind of that percentage change year over year for the total levy. So that's all your operational funds, capital fund, and all your existing debt and all the new debt service for all the capital projects that were identified for borrowing out through 2034.
Yeah, I guess the disconnect in my head is that we can only increase the levy by net new construction, which is not as big as these numbers are showing. And I suppose debt service.
And the reason.
Go ahead.
Exactly. No, you just said it. You took the words out of my mouth. It's the debt service adjustment. So, as your levy is increasing for debt service, you can increase your allowable levy to cover that. So that's above and beyond the net new construction. So that's why, the overall levy increase has been higher than your net new construction, because you're increasing your allowable levy to also cover your debt service payments, which is permitted under state law. So I think one of the, potentially unintended consequences of levy limits has been, it's, maybe not as much so in Fitchburg, but we've seen this in other communities, is that, you've been able to continue to maintain a capital projects levy that we kind of showed here on the chart, which is a great, financial strategy. I mean, absent levy limits, to the extent that you could levy as much as possible and pay cash for capital projects, you get no argument from us. That's that's a preferable financial strategy. But that capital levy is subject to that same net new construction limitation. And so, some communities that have, maybe maintained that have had to reduce it or eliminate it altogether, because they just, they need that levy authority to pay for their ongoing operations. So the fact that you still have that as a key component of your budget is still a strong budgetary strength for the city.
That's really great information. Thanks for contextualizing that, Greg. Other questions? It's a lot to absorb. I don't see anyone else, so the slides will be coming, posted on the website. And obviously, we can always follow up with additional questions if something else comes up. And certainly this isn't the last time that we'll see this. It does get easier year over year to kind of absorb it, so it just takes time. But yeah. Misty, do you want to add anything?
Just to reiterate what you just said, so yes, we will post these out on the website probably by the end of the week, and I'll send out the link to all of you so that you have it. But it is on just the city's, so finance department and then financial reports, it's on there under the financial management plan.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, given that, we can move on to our next item. Item 6B, Fitchburg, Oregon Collaborative Development. And Administrator Chad Brecklin, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good evening again, everyone. Got a presentation this evening in regards to a potential rekindled conversation regarding collaborative development opportunity between the Village of Oregon and the City of Fitchburg. I'll work my way through the PowerPoint. If there are any questions, I'm fine if you want to ask them as they pop up this evening. I just have probably less than 20 slides, so I'll obviously breeze through those. But again, ask any questions you have as we go along, and then there'll be an opportunity at the end for some discussion and direction. So, in regards to the presentation this evening, these are the topics I would like to cover. The area of development interest, previous considerations of development interest in this particular area, the current basis as to why we're talking about it, considerations for moving forward with potential development. I've identified a potential timeline, and also then again the discussion and direction. So our area of development interest, I've got a couple of maps here to highlight the area in which we're talking about. But you can see an overall city map here with a circled area. That's generally the interchange with the U.S. Highway 14, County Highway M, and County Highway MM in the far southeast corner of the city of Fitchburg and just to the north of the Village of Oregon. You can see a bit more in a bit more detail in this particular screenshot of exactly the area that we're talking about this evening. And you can see the lighter shaded area is the city of Fitchburg. I have highlighted the boundary with the village and town of Oregon in the lower portion of the screen there. You can see that the town of Dunn is just off to the right. And then you can see Highway 14, County Highway MM, County Highway M, and then a rail line that runs through this particular area as well. So there have been previous considerations for development of this particular area on 3 different occasions during the mid-1990s into the mid-2005 area. So approximately 20 years ago was the last time in which this was considered by the Fitchburg Common Council. And in each of those 3 prior occurrences, for one reason or another, whether it be originating from the city of Fitchburg or the Village of Oregon, a consensus or agreement could not be reached in order to proceed with potential development of this area. Largely, the main factors for that are the development process and our parameters, the terms of which couldn't be agreed upon, or there were some concerns regarding service delivery to this particular area. And I've just included a few screenshots of some documents that have been created over the years just to demonstrate the fact that there certainly has been some time spent on this previously, and we're looking to potentially rekindle some conversation here.
Hey, Chad.
Yeah.
Sorry, not to interrupt. Is there any way we could get this presentation showing on these smaller screens? Sorry, I forgot my glasses. I do love looking at Joe's face, but it's not as informative as what's up there. Thank you. You're the best.
Thank you, Scott. So the current basis for interest largely stems around a recent acquisition of land in this area by the Oregon School District. I've highlighted this parcel here in orange for visual aid, and that parcel is approximately 105 acres in size. The purchase of this particular land has been one of 2 factors for why we're bringing this forward for consideration again. And the second factor is Mayor Radafrada had met with the village president for Oregon, and it's my understanding that during that conversation, the village president of Oregon brought this particular topic up again and had mentioned that Oregon has an interest as well in rekindling the conversation. So the Oregon School District, for their growth projections, is indicating that this site may include 2 schools in the future. They anticipate that the first school district project would be around 2030, and that a middle school is likely to be the first project. Of course, that could change, and that there is also potential to add an elementary school to this site as well. And of course, there'd be consideration for some athletic, recreational fields and other playgrounds being possible at the site. Of course, in order for all of this to materialize, it's going to require some multi-jurisdictional collaboration for these projects to occur. As a result of this particular purchase, we've had a handful of meetings between City of Fitchburg and the Village of Oregon staff to kind of talk about how this particular development opportunity could come to fruition. And we've also had a meeting with the 2 administrators as well as the school district superintendent as well to kind of ensure that we have their perspective with this discussion in mind also. So some of the considerations for moving forward and why we feel there's a real good reason to continue the conversation is, the realization of the school district projects creates an opportunity for further development of this area. Clearly, the infrastructure is an advantage here. You have a multi-lane highway in US Highway 14. You have 2 county highways in Highway M and Highway MM, and you also have a rail line. Creates an opportunity to enhance the County Highway MM corridor north of the Village of Oregon. Which again, just as a reminder of what we're talking about here with the interchange in place, Highway 14, Highway M, rail line, and County Highway M, with the opportunity to enhance this corridor in particular as you enter the Village of Oregon. This would create some economic development opportunities, potentially, and of course this would all need to be decided through some planning processes, but obviously some considerations for the following would definitely be appropriate. Light industrial or manufacturing sites, commercial or other development related sites, with obviously the idea of adding additional employment opportunities in the area. And there is also an opportunity to add residential housing units. And of course, we all recognize we're in a supply situation or deficit as it relates to housing units. And creating additional housing capacity will hopefully help meeting the demand and population growth in the area for housing. And again, while all this would need to be decided, the residential units, at least in some kind of conceptual planning conversations, would largely be right along the Highway MM corridor and likely would be of higher density housing. Perhaps mixed use related development could be the most appropriate there. But again, there would need to be some extensive conversation and planning process to identify what makes the most sense and how that area could be potentially developed. And of course, following up on the presentation we just had from Ellers and the challenges that we have with levy limits, this does create an additional opportunity for tax base and revenue for both the Village of Oregon, the City of Fitchburg, and the Oregon School District. This is an area that likely, if it were to develop through just a City of Fitchburg process, as we work our way south down the Highway 14 corridor, is probably a good 20 or more years away from developing. So by collaborating with Oregon, we could potentially accelerate the development timeline here and be able to capture the tax base and revenue that would be generated from any development projects that would result. So some of the initial steps, as I've discussed with the Oregon Village Administrator, include obviously determining support this evening from the Fitchburg Common Council. The village administrator as well as the village president have indicated that the Village of Oregon board is informed of potential conversations and is supportive of those conversations being rekindled. We'd also want to identify the development area, and through that process, assessing the interest of the property owners in this particular area in future development opportunities for their property. And when we look at the potential development area, we have a few different options as I see it. And using this rail line as kind of the delineator, if we look at this yellow highlighted area, that is Wisconsin Department of Corrections owned land. We don't know, obviously, if they have an interest in potentially developing that land, but it would be worthwhile to have a conversation with the Department of Corrections to see if that would be the case. The Oregon School District parcel is highlighted here or shaded in orange, and then the other parcels that we feel could be under consideration for this development area are highlighted in blue. When you look at the total developable area for the purposes of this conversation, we're looking at approximately 570 acres if you look at all three of these shaded colors. If for whatever reason the Department of Corrections did not have any interest in participating and we just looked to develop east of the rail line and west of Highway 14, we'd be looking at approximately 325 acres of developable land, with about 105 of those acres being owned by the school district. And I will say the school district is interested in being a partner here and potentially creating a portion of their parcel as developable land for amenities or features such as housing, daycare, those sorts of things that might be complementary to the school district use there. So considerations, if the council is interested in moving forward, include the development of an intergovernmental agreement that would identify the areas of responsibility. Largest considerations would be public safety in regards to police, fire, and EMS. Obviously, roadway, parks, stormwater, and other public facilities and infrastructure maintenance would have to be determined. And of course, revenue sharing would need to be identified, how we would approach sharing or splitting the revenue that was created from this development. Joint master planning of the development area would have to occur. A couple of things that would likely be helpful in the process here as we look to potentially develop this area is including this area in our conversations and during our upcoming Fitchburg comprehensive plan update that we anticipate will start early next year. And also, much like we're doing with the South Stoner Prairie neighborhood and the Greenfield neighborhood, identifying a specific plan for this area as well, in addition to discussing it and potentially including it in our comprehensive plan. And then when we look at a service delivery component related to the urban service area, i.e. municipal water and sewer, I've got a couple of slides here that show that this is essentially an infill opportunity adjacent to existing urban service areas. The next map here shows urban service area boundaries from the CARPC, Capital Area Regional Planning Commission database, and you can see where the Fitchburg urban service area is on the top of the slide, and you can see the Village of Oregon's urban service area at the bottom edge of the highlighted area that we're talking about that's circled. And then you can see an additional urban service area located within the city of Fitchburg that is serviced by the Village of Oregon. That particular area is the Department of Corrections facility, Oak Hill Corrections, the Oregon Correctional Farm. And this area has been receiving urban services from the Village of Oregon for quite some time. It's been going on, I think, for as long as I've been with the city, that they've had urban service from the Village of Oregon. As I understand it, the rail line corridor serves as where the sewer and water was extended up to the correctional facility. And you can't really see it very well, but where my cursor is on this particular map, there's a little white dot. And for anybody who's been down in this area, an Oregon water tower is located right there in the city of Fitchburg, in fact, on an Oregon-owned parcel. So in some regards, I think we can consider this to be an infill opportunity since we already have urban service area in this vicinity and running through this particular development area. So when we look at a potential timeline, I've created a Gantt chart to kind of show at least some of the major components that would have to be completed in regards to realizing the development opportunity. I've highlighted, obviously, the Fitchburg Common Council meeting occurring in June of 2024, our meeting this evening, and then continued initial staff planning meetings to kind of create a plan, so to speak, in more detail, occurring for the remainder of this year and into the first quarter of 2025. Working on the intergovernmental agreement beginning second quarter of 2025 and continuing through the second quarter of 2026. And then looking at the Fitchburg Comprehensive Plan update beginning early next year, and continuing into mid-2026. And then obviously creating that area or neighborhood master plan. That could begin in the second half of 2026 and continue into the second half of 2027. There's also a possibility that there could be some overlap and concurrence with the Fitchburg Comp Plan update, and potentially move that farther to the left on this particular chart, either earlier in 26 or towards the end of 25, depending on resources and capacity and how conversations are going. And then looking at the urban service amendment, that would be done obviously through the CARPC amendment process, beginning in the final quarter of 2027 into the first quarter of 2028. If the Common Council was interested in creating a TID district, we could look to create a TID district in early 2028. Initial infrastructure could go in second quarter of 2028 and going through the third quarter. And then by the fourth quarter of 2028, the land or site could be ready for projects. That's just a tentative timeline based on some joint conversations that we've had with the Village of Oregon. Again, fluid, flexible. There could be other steps that may come up or be needed to be added into this chart, or other adjustments may need to be made. So that is a very brief overview of the process, and now obviously happy to answer any questions, have discussion, and then ultimately I'd be interested to see if the council is interested in continuing the conversation with the Village of Oregon, or if you would feel otherwise.
Thank you so much, Chad.
Yeah.
I'm curious if the mayor wants to add anything about our conversations.
We brought this to the council because we have been, remember, it was last year when I met with the village, and then we started talking about, the school is going to be the catalyst, because, the school is in our city, but the water and sewer is on Oregon. And our parcel, they don't have access to water and sewer. But the water and sewer is there, you know what I mean? So, and I know, talking to Mike Zimmerman, that in the past there were multiple conversations about possible doing something here, but for one reason or another, or Fitchburg wanted to do it and the village didn't want to do it and something like that. But I think, I open to the idea. I think if the school is moving forward, and it's going to move forward, we need to have any sort of, intergovernment agreement with them. And also, I didn't know until when you showed me the map that I didn't know that the correction site, they are an urban service area, that they are already getting water and sewer, and I didn't have a clue. So I think this is why we need to look at this. This is it could be a potential area for having parcel for light industrial parcel that we need, housing, and I think that between the conversation that we have, we are kind of like, why we don't do it? You know what I mean? It's beneficial for the two municipalities. Yes, there are other consequences of things that we need to consider. How to serve some of the services there, like police, fire, EMS, So by that one, we can also work with Oregon and have an intergovernment agreement too, So I don't know. I am open to the idea. This is what I want to know. What do you think, guys?
Can you explain, just on that last note, that was one of the questions I had. Can you explain the nuance of fire, police, EMS services shared there? Only because I know we have schools on property owned by other municipalities within our city. That's my assumption, that like the Stoner Prairie School, for example, right, is probably owned by the Verona School District, the Verona School District. So like, why is this unique? Is it something we haven't done before because of the interesting urban service area? Or
it's the location, because you need to, everything is centralized here, and then you need to send police, EMS, and fire over there. It's like.
So if we wanted to use Oregon and say, could you help out in this? Okay.
I know. Okay.
Yeah, there would be some standard mutual aid agreements that would exist with or without an intergovernmental agreement. Typically, for an ambulance call, if it's of a critical nature, they're going to send the closest ambulance regardless of the jurisdiction with which it's in. Same goes for fire. There's a lot of automatic aid agreements that just automatically happen, depending upon the nature of the call and the location of the call. That still doesn't mean that, the jurisdiction who has primary responsibility won't also be responding, but it will obviously take them a little longer to respond than perhaps the closest unit. And the same goes for police. If it's an emergency situation, they're going to start dispatching the closest police units available regardless of the jurisdiction. And then the jurisdiction that's responsible will ultimately likely take over the investigation or scene and so forth. Now, of course, there could be a possibility to create an intergovernmental agreement that, the Village of Oregon, for instance, would have primary responsibility for response. Maybe we would have primary responsibility for investigation. Who knows? But that could all be discussed through the intergovernmental agreement process. And then, of course, how does the potential revenue sharing shake out based upon what the agreement looks like?
Bill?
Yeah. I guess, we've got urban service area to the north and the south. So from that perspective, it seems like, it's efficient to do the infill development there. I'm not a particular fan of putting either housing or schools next to highways. There's, 20,000 plus vehicles on Highway 14 every day, and between 10 and 15,000 on Highway M. I do see that the Village of Oregon has both housing and a high school nestled up right against Highway 14. I would be very interested to see, basically everything we listed on last night's resolution opposing expansion of the Beltline. What's the ambient noise like? What's the particulate matter? What's the gaseous air pollution like in those areas immediately next to the highway? I think it probably makes, in my mind, it makes more sense to put the industrial and manufacturing next to the highway instead. But so that'd be my primary concern, is the health and safety of the people who are going to live there and or go to school there.
Well, but they already purchased the land, so the Oregon school already owned the land there, so the Oregon school already purchased that parcel, so we don't have any control of what they are planning to do with that parcel. You know what I mean? So.
Jay?
I apologize for being late. What area are we exactly talking about here?
Scott, I got the map up on my screen. Jay, you've obviously been present for one of the three occurrences of this conversation that I had mentioned. We're talking about the potential for the collaborative development, rekindling that conversation with the Village of Oregon, based upon a conversation that the village president had with the mayor, and the purchase of 105 acres highlighted here in orange by the Oregon School District, which they are anticipating 2 schools to be built there if we can obviously come to a collaborative arrangement to facilitate those schools to be developed. So in light of the conversation and in light of the land purchase by the school district, we felt that it would be worthwhile to at least assess the Fitchburg Common Council's interest in rekindling this conversation. And we've already learned from the Village of Oregon that their board is supportive of rekindling the conversation to see if something can be worked out.
Okay, so when this came up previously, the idea was to build some sort of industrial park there. And I was 100% opposed to that. And it doesn't appear to me that there's any reason for my opinion to change. First of all, I don't understand why the Oregon School District would buy this piece of property without having this conversation first. That just seems to be a cart before the horse. So I don't really care that the Oregon School District bought it. They bought it, okay, but just because they bought it doesn't mean we're compelled to act and do something for it. When the original Fitchburg, Oregon Business Park proposal came forward, we were looking at the property tax revenue that would be generated by it and trying to figure out whether Fitchburg could provide services there. This is a little more complex than just saying, well, let's have the Oregon Fire Department, Oregon Police Department, Oregon EMS take care of it, because we have a paramedic level service. Oregon does not. We have a essentially full-time staffed fire department. Oregon does not. And I don't really know enough about how their police department functions right now, but regardless of that, whatever facilities go there are not going to have anything close to the same level of service that we provide everywhere else in the city. And their property taxes are, well, if it's schools, it's going to be tax exempt. So they're not going to be contributing to the property tax base at all. It's just going to be sitting there, requiring services without really providing anything to us in return. So I don't know why this, I know why Oregon wants to do this. Totally get that. I don't know how it makes any sense for Fitchburg to want to do this.
Because we need industrial parcels, big parcels, and we don't have it right now. And that one could be a place where we can have those opportunities. And we have the water and the sewer is looking there at our parcels, okay?
Why exactly do we need that?
Because we need that because we need it for growth, and also we need it because some companies are coming to the region and sometimes they are requesting we have those type of parcels, and we are missing a lot of opportunities.
Well, but some of those opportunities aren't necessarily good for the city.
It depends. We don't know. It
well,
depends.
Look, we have a number of big occupying lots of space users in the city. And some of them are occupying a lot more space than what they actually need, because some of these users are users who like to have a lot of space around their buildings. And maybe they want to build gigantic parking lots. And maybe they want to do other things that aren't good for the city. So the idea of doing compact development isn't just limited to residential. We should be looking at it for commercial and industrial users also.
Yeah.
And so the idea that someone wants to come in, I remember the whole Flim Flam show that went on when Epic was approaching Fitchburg to try to locate here. And they've done the same thing. They have over 300 acres in Verona, and very little of that land is actually occupied with buildings that they are using for their business. So I don't agree with the idea that we need to have big, huge, large lots for these types of businesses. I still am astounded that the one right across the street from where I live got approved, because that's in what's supposed to be the most dense area of Fitchburg, according to Smart Code, and that parcel got pulled out and developed with a building that has probably 120 acres around it that's not going to be developed because it's owned by this one user. So I just don't, I mean, just because somebody says they want to come and build a big industrial place in Fitchburg doesn't mean it's good for the city.
Well, we don't know yet until we do our homework and we determine, we need to do some research and determine if this is possible, no, feasible or no. But we shouldn't be saying no because you had a very bad experience 20 years ago. We need to be open to the possibility.
Back and forth. Chad, do you want to show the timeline? Because Jay, we're talking about potentially looking at a CIP or a comp plan update followed by a neighborhood plan. This is not like there will be a planning process in place.
Of course there will.
Yeah. Okay.
I was involved with this once before.
Okay, I know, but you missed the beginning of the
I
presentation.
did.
Who else would anyone like to speak? Nicole.
I think it would be interesting to. I'm glad to hear both like a pro and a con, because as this was first introduced, I was like, well, what are the drawbacks of engaging in the conversation? And I think it is important to note when two communities can benefit from each other, and then when one is bringing more to the table than the other. And when just as far as like establishment goes, right, to the point of like we have a more established fire department, which I think is an interesting conversation that you brought up, Chad, in terms of like we have to decide what those services look like. And so I think I'm just trying to understand where it fits in terms of where do we identify that there is a business need that makes sense for the community that will go around there? Like where in this timeline, because the developing the intergovernmental agreement is happening before the area master plan. And so I guess based on what Jay said, that would probably be my only question in terms of like, and it might just be my ignorance of like, I've not ever created a TID. I've just benefited from one closing on a board. So if you could speak to like specifically why those two pieces are happening kind of in that sequence.
Yeah, I think we'd want to establish whether or not an intergovernmental agreement can be reached that makes sense for both communities. Because if we can't reach an intergovernmental agreement, then it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense to do the neighborhood master plan. So I think that's why we've identified that as the potential timeline and the sequence of steps there that could be utilized. But again, as I mentioned, there's some flexibility there, and if we're directed to proceed, there could be some changes in the steps and the timing and so forth. But at the end of the day, the two communities are going to need to come to an agreement in order to be able to move forward. And, we would want to ensure that that was even possible before we spend a ton of resources on the planning side of things.
One of the things that, in terms of like a benefit that I always think of is, and the fact that we had the financial presentation, is good context. I mean, levy limits, right? We need to grow in order to keep up. So I think that's always a driving force of some of this development, because we kind of have no choice but to grow if we want to keep up. So that incentive is always interesting to me. It doesn't let us make decisions in a pure, is this good or is this bad way, because we have to grow.
Yeah, it's, just right now, based on what our equalized value is, a 3% net new construction for us is $175 million a year. And, we're looking at approximately 2%, a little bit less than 2% right now, as we're trending for the most recent budget that we're going to be planning for 2025. So, by way of comparison, we had a 3.7% net new construction for the development of this year's operating budget. So we're going to be working with, approximately 50% less of a levy limit increase moving into the 2025 budget that we had for the 2024 budget. And merely having a 3% net new construction allows us really to maintain the existing services that we're providing. That doesn't necessarily allow us to add services, expand services, or add new staff, because typically the cost to provide our existing services trends at about 3%, depending upon what we're experiencing. So
I think that's one of the primary benefits, right?
Yeah.
Is it's a place to grow. And I guess a couple of my questions is that 2 areas in blue that you showed, are those landowners even wanting to sell for development? Because I know we've had some agricultural land that the owners have expressed no interest in ever developing.
That would be one of the other things we'd want to do initially is assess who's interested in even developing the land. We know that at least one landowner west of Highway MM and east of the railroad tracks is interested in developing. They contact the city regularly and asked if there ever is going to be any change. I don't know if they've reached out to the mayor recently, but usually once a year, they reach out to Mike Zimmerman and ask if there's any chance that this is going to come back up because they have an interest in developing. Obviously, as I mentioned, we'd want to have a conversation with the Department of Corrections and see if they have any interest in participating in this, since they have approximately 245 acres that could be incorporated into this potential development. That's highlighted in yellow. And then I think there's one, this parcel here is owned by one individual. This parcel here is owned by one individual. And then I think roughly through here, this parcel is owned by a different party than this parcel down here. So there's not a large number of landowners in here. So I think it's a matter of, again, that's another kind of point of consideration. If, we have had joint conversations between the city and the village with these particular parcel owners, and they're like, yeah, we don't have any interest, then maybe that's also the end of it also.
Well, the other question I have too is about in terms of the infrastructure. Like, are we going to be putting ourselves in a situation like with Terravesa where we have to build a lift station? Like, is this going to be gravity sewer? And like, what do we know about how the extensions of the utilities will work?
I'm going to suspect, but I certainly can't confirm. I don't know the answer to that question on the gravity side of things. But as we pointed out with the urban service area boundaries from the CARPC website, with the correctional center being serviced by Oregon Sewer and Water currently, I can confirm whether or not there's a lift station there. My suspicion is there isn't, unless it's specifically owned and maintained by the Department of Corrections.
Yeah, I'm just curious about that. Jay?
When we had this discussion before, there was a map that showed that part of it could be gravity sewered to Oregon's wastewater, and part of it would have to be pumped up to the, so that it could gravity sewer to it. So part of it will have to have a lift station.
Okay. And we can certainly, rekindle that map if it, and take a look at that.
But I don't know, I don't even know how that would work, because that would be an Oregon lift station. I don't know if we would be expected to own that. One of the things that I brought up when this cockamamie idea originally came up was that we should just have a discussion with Oregon about having a jurisdictional transfer of the property and making it part of the Village of Oregon, because it doesn't, to me, make a lot of sense. I mean, when Fitchburg incorporated as a city, we had to take the entire township, which I don't think was really it wasn't the ideal situation, but it was the only way to make it work because of the battle that was going on with Madison at the time. So I think if there had been a way to only incorporate part, we would not have gone anywhere near that far south. So as it is right now, that was what we had to do, and that's why the city kind of looks like a square with a raggedy top edge. So I think that may be a worthwhile discussion, is to talk about what what kind of agreement we could come up with to have a jurisdictional transfer over, say, a 20-year period of time, because there'd have to be some revenue sharing if we're giving up the property tax for that long. So that I think would be a better option than us trying to develop that and provide services that far away from the central core of the city. I mean, even if we follow our comprehensive plan, we're not going to have development down there for 60, 70, 80 years if we continue going down the rail corridor. And the rail corridor doesn't even go where this parcel is that keeps getting brought up.
Any other perspectives from other council members? Bill?
Yeah, I guess just kind of piggybacking on a bunch of earlier comments. So like the intergovernmental agreement, I guess I'm not sure entirely what that entails, but it seems like a master plan would lay out at a broad, high level what's going to be developed there. And that's going to inform, how much property tax could reasonably be extracted. And it seems like you would need to know that before you enter into an agreement with the neighboring municipality. But I don't know like I said, I don't know what goes into an IGA. But I am curious, so whatever property taxes are generated, how would those be allocated between the city of Fitchburg, where the parcel exists, and the village of Oregon, who owns the water and sewer infrastructure?
That would all be subject to negotiation. I'd hate to speculate on what that would look like. Obviously I would suspect that we would have a notable majority of the revenue coming in, since it's within the Fitchburg jurisdictional boundaries. But again, until we knew what exactly was in the IGA, if, for instance, Oregon was responsible for maintaining the entire area, public safety, roadways, parks, stormwater facilities, all public infrastructure, then maybe that cost-sharing arrangement shifts in a different level. I think it all depends on to what level Oregon is servicing it specifically versus Fitchburg.
Yeah. So I guess, Gabrielle, you had mentioned that, we need to grow in order to increase our levy limit. And growing here may not increase our levy limit to nearly the extent that it would if this growth were happening further north.
Yeah. And I'm not saying we should. I'm just saying, you know what I mean? We have to if we want to grow the levy. Does Joe or Dave have any input? I hadn't seen you on the screen for a little while, so just giving you a chance. Donald or Jim?
No comment, Gabriella.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
Jim?
As usual, the devil is in the details.
Yeah.
And the cost is what I would be really concerned about. Is the Fitchburg taxpayer going to be subsidizing this in some way with increased costs because of public services? So I'll be looking for a little bit more detail. But I think it's a good thing to actually explore. I wouldn't say don't explore it.
Yeah.
But you got to see the details.
Yeah, that's just where I am too. Just trying to look at it more and kind of, as the mayor mentioned, do some more research and kind of look into this first. I don't think there's any harm in doing that.
Yeah, I guess it's such an interesting question because it's I see so many pitfalls, where this is going to fall apart, which is probably why it happened 3 times and then fell apart. But so I don't want to waste staff time on something that is maybe has a good shot of falling apart, but also it would be interesting to have more information. And I don't know what the order of that information to come back in. What's the most likely fail point? Investigate that first. Do people even want to sell the land to develop? It seems like a pretty big, yes, no, and then we can approach it from there. I mean, I'm open to the idea, but yeah, I just see a lot of points of failure.
I was just going to say, Chad, are any of those pitfalls, technically going around this could happen again, or have those been avoided, or are not in the mix anymore, which brought this up again for us to even be discussing it, so it doesn't go or fall a victim of what happened the previous 2 times?
Well, we'd want to do some review of the previous documents that were created. They may identify some of the pitfalls that are out there. Obviously, the vast majority of elected officials and city staff have changed in the last 20 years. So I don't know if any of the people involved, were potential obstacles to reaching an agreement either. And, I think perhaps sometimes a fresh set of people and personalities can overcome things that had happened in the past. I'm not saying that's a guarantee by any stretch of the imagination, but it at least appears that, Oregon, for instance, is interested in having a conversation. There is a school, potentially 2 schools that may go there, which obviously, a significant portion of our community, would have children that potentially go there, particularly if you're talking a middle school as being one of the 2 schools that would be there. So it'd be obviously closer than what they're currently going to on the south side of Oregon, where the middle school is. So, we'll look at it and see if we can avoid what had been pitfalls previously, but as many have pointed out, there are a lot of details to work out. I don't know if they can all be worked out. I think initial conversations have at least been positive, and there's a desire to see if we can get those details worked out, at least in the staff conversations that have been had. We feel it's a worthwhile challenge to explore, and see if we can get to a point where there's an appropriate resolution or solution that meets the needs of both communities.
Jay, and then
Well, I just want to point out again, since you mentioned this again, that if a large portion of that is going to be used for schools, I'm not opposed to schools, but they are property tax exempt. So the idea of increasing our tax levy or increasing our total valuation is not going to happen by putting schools there. And I just don't see how this makes any sense for Fitchburg. I think it makes a lot of sense for Oregon, which is why Oregon keeps bringing it up. But from a Fitchburg standpoint, I just don't see any way that this makes any sense.
So eventually we will need to have an intergovernmental agreement because if they move forward with the construction of the school, they need to bring the pipes to the Fitchburg, area. So they will need our authorization and permit. So eventually we will need to work with Oregon because of the school. Okay. You can say whatever, but
say no. This is not appropriate, and the school should locate somewhere else.
Okay, I disagree with the way you're thinking, and also I think we need to look how this region is going to look in the next 20 years, So we are not making decision for tomorrow or for the next 5 years. We are looking at this area, how it's going to look in 20 years. So, and I think we need to at least say, let's try to see if we can do something. Let's not say no at the beginning. Let's open this and say, okay, let's do our homework and see it can work. If it doesn't work, at the end of the day, we say no. But coming and say no because no, I understand all that. I get all the things that you're saying. But also we need to see what other potential is there, what other benefits, and maybe we are not seeing right now. That's it.
Yeah.
Chad, I looked up something on the internet. The Wisconsin State Journal reported that this occurred in 2005, and there was an actual agreement that was signed. Have you found that?
I'm not aware of an agreement having been signed.
Yes.
I think that there was a tentative agreement that had been reached at one point in time between 2 mayoral administrations, and then there was a change. That agreement, I believe, may have been tentatively reached right before an election concluded, and then a new mayor came in and may have changed those terms.
Happened.
No?
No.
do you remember?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jay.
There were discussions that were ongoing, and there were some tentative things put together, but there was no agreement that was ever approved. In fact, when it came to a vote at the Common Council. In 2005, Tom Clowder was mayor. He also got reelected in 2007. I got elected in 2009. So nothing happened. There was no administration change that happened to change this. The council voted it down. And it was I think it was a 7-1 vote.
Thank you for clarifying that. I think I got that confused with the Morissette-Vivian change. I think there had been potentially some tentative...
Oh, that was earlier.
Yeah, that was, I think,
that was
maybe
1999.
2000. Yeah, so that I think there had been some agreements that had been made under Morissette that perhaps changed under Vivian. So my apologies for getting those two timeframes mixed up. Thank you.
Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, my point is if you find some documentation, if you could just send it to us, right away.
Sure.
There was actually a plan for there was we showed that basically it was the orange and the blue piece to the right. That was what was going to be the Fitchburg, Oregon Business Park, and there was not the one to the west of MM.
Okay.
Just that area, and that was there was a plan that actually had been drawn up. It wasn't like a super detailed plan with lot lines and everything on it, but it was something not quite as detailed as, it was probably something more akin to that. It was not quite as detailed as what we do with a neighborhood plan, but it was something that showed what the potential users could be.
So it looks like this particular map, this is one of the snapshots I was able to capture. I haven't had a chance to look through any of these documents that were completed, but I just wanted to at least point out to the council that obviously over that 10-year period, there had been documents created. And this particular map is one of those documents I think that you're talking about, Jay, and it does look like it may go west of MM here and that this is the rail line coming down.
Well, this is the first time I've ever seen that map. So that says Village of Oregon, so that may be something they were
This is an entirely
working on.
different document with the village. These are all just I'll see if I might have this screenshot. Let me just
I don't think that's what made it to a council vote.
That may not. I just know that it was created here. Let me see if I can grab that.
Hey, Gabriella.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can somebody remind me when we renew the comprehensive plan? It's soon, right?
Mayor.
The idea is to start the process next year.
Okay. I guess just thinking aloud, it does seem like it seems like it would be advantageous to have enough conversation with the village to inform our comprehensive planning process.
They know our time frame because they are planning also to revise their own comp plan. So the idea is to do it.
Sure.
It's going to be.
But to Jay's point, unless you're mistaken, which we all could be because we're all human, right? But to your point earlier when you stated that area isn't slated to be developed for 60 to 70 years or whatever it might be, then if we're saying, no, it should be developed sooner than that because we need to grow, we need additional space, then I would assume we would update the comprehensive plan to say as such. And it just seems like having this conversation with Oregon makes a ton of sense, and then pausing so that we can update the comprehensive plan to reflect as such. Maybe that's maybe that's not the order that it happens in, but it seems like a more kind of planful and holistic conversation, but it does seem like you'd probably have to have some conversations with them before that process to see what they're interested in.
The idea is to have this conversation during the revision of the comp plan because you need to create like a future urban service area in that.
So those are supposed to
That one is
dovetail.
part of the when you look at the comp plan and revision, you are looking for future service urban areas. So this one could be a new one, and this is when you have those conversations at that time.
Okay, so it's supposed to be kind of synergistically.
This is the idea. This is why
Gotcha.
in the time frame you can see.
This is a map that was located from 2004.
So the comprehensive plan used to have a section in it. I don't know if it does anymore because I haven't read it recently and it's been modified a lot, but there used to be a section in there that said that we do not support leapfrog development, We want our urban development to be contiguous with the current urban service areas, which this obviously is not. So the whole idea of having this discussion is utterly it's not consistent with that section of the comprehensive plan.
So to clarify, you would be opposed to moving forward with this in any way?
I'm opposed to it 100%. Like I said, I don't think anything's changed, except now there will be even less property tax revenue if we're building schools there. And back then, you know, the idea of having a lot of office and business and industrial stuff, those types of developments tend to not generate as much property tax revenue as other stuff does because of the types of buildings they are. And now, even now that the, I would like to, by the way, as I'm thinking about this, I would like to get some information about how the personal property tax is going to affect us in the future, because we have had some users that have a lot of, some of the industrial users have a lot of personal property that we used to get reimbursed from the state for, and now that's not happening anymore.
So I'll defer that to Ms. Teal. I'll ask that question. But my understanding is the state made us whole when they exempted the personal property tax.
Right, but
with
not
a payment.
for the future, right?
I believe it continues on.
Well, for past users, but not for new users.
No, of course, because new users there is no such
Right,
thing as a personal
exactly.
property tax any longer.
So like the data center that we have that has millions of dollars of computers, just up the hill.
Computers are tax exempt from personal property taxes. Manufacturing company, they have plenty of exemption. So for personal property
that
tax.
may be, but the bottom line is.
I know because I do that for living.
Okay, but these tend to be big warehouse buildings. These industrial users tend to be big warehouse buildings, and when we were looking back then, I don't remember what the exact numbers were, but we were looking at valuations per acre and comparing things like Hatchery Hill and Swan Creek and other developments to what this was going to do, which was something around a third of the total assessed valuation per acre for industrial property, which is just the way industrial works, especially when you have users coming in looking for, they want 50 acres to build a user like Target, for example, that came in to build a 2.5 acre building with a 17-acre parking lot. Parking lots just don't assess very well.
The big difference, though, I think, between now and then is that there's a lot less developable land in the urban service area now as compared to back in 2005 or 1995. There was a lot more contiguous to...
We're in the middle of 3 neighborhood plans right now, so...
Yeah, no expansion of the urban service area yet.
And that's one of the things that I was trying to bring out in the last discussion that we had, which is that... When we're talking about, regardless of that, when we're talking about industrial users, they need to realize that in the way Fitchburg is developing, we're not going to just throw up a 50-acre parcel to build a 2-acre building on.
Okay.
That doesn't make any sense.
Just getting back to the question at hand, I guess it's very clear you're not interested in moving forward. What I've heard from some of the other council members is that there's some interest in at least exploring. I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads, the interest in exploring further. I think there's some value in exploring. I mean, Village of Oregon is a partner, like we're just talking about Lake Barney. We need to have a culvert built through there so that we can fix the Lake Barney problem. Like, there's other things that we're going to interact with. So I feel like in a gesture of good faith, we should at least consider this. And maybe it is going to be bad for Fitchburg. It sounds like maybe there are a lot of indications that it would be, but I don't want to kill it at this point, and it sounds like the majority of the council would like to at least move forward. Bill, do you have a comment?
Well, I mean, given that there's been 3 failures, I guess that doesn't instill a lot of confidence in this attempt. But certainly Jay's concerns are valid. And I think it's every 20 years or so, I guess it's worth looking at it again and find out how do the finances work out, And maybe we put some conditions in that say, well, it's got to generate X dollars of tax revenue per acre or we're just not going to do it,
Yeah. Jim?
Yeah, I would like to hear what Mike Zimmerman would say about this, because I think he has a vision on economic things and industry And it would be good to get his opinion on this. If, during a staff meeting, you could bring it up just to see what he says.
I have had some conversations with Mike. I certainly don't want to speak for him. And Mike actually participated in one of the meetings that occurred between staff of Fitchburg and Oregon. And I'm generally suspecting that Mike is supportive of this, but I prefer you guys to hear it directly from him.
I think it's also worthwhile thinking about what Alder Allen suggested of maybe we transfer jurisdiction of the land. Like maybe that's part of the conversation and that sounds like that hasn't been really discussed fully before either. So, and maybe that is the long-term solution. I don't know. Everything should be on the table, I think, at this point. And it sounds like if Oregon is still interested, I feel like we have to have the conversation again,
Well, that's where I would prefer to push this toward a jurisdictional transfer. And obviously there'll have to be some compensation, because normally when municipalities transfer, so part of the problem is Oregon doesn't really have any land that Fitchburg wants because it's just too far away. So normally when this kind of thing happens with incorporated municipalities like cities and villages, you would trade a piece of land. But there's not anything that's in Oregon that we would want to attach to Fitchburg. So that particular conversation isn't really one that can happen. So it's going to have to be a financial arrangement and it may be like a 20-year financial arrangement, which would be fine. But I think it clearly makes a great deal of sense for Oregon to develop this property if they want to, and makes very little sense for Fitchburg to do so.
Any other comments?
I think
Nicole.
Yeah, I think on both sides, I'm super interested in hearing, Gabriella, kind of how you put it. Like, I don't think anything should be off the table, including Alder Allen's suggestion and including fully developing it. Like, I would love to just have the experts from city staff go in, with all of the options on the table and come back and present, which I think is what you're kind of asking. Like, we're not saying like, yes, go do this. We're saying like, please go find information and run all the scenarios so that we have enough information to come back to the comprehensive plan, which sounds super reasonable and like a very data-driven way to take it with a lot of the background that Alder Allen has provided.
Do you feel like you have what you needed, Chad?
Yeah, it sounds as though that the majority of the council is at least willing to explore. And even I think, I don't want to speak for you, Jay, but even if one of the options is jurisdictional transfer, that may be something that even you might be supportive of.
I'd be all in favor of that.
So
if we can come up with something
Sure.
that works.
Yeah, so that certainly can be on the table as we look at this. And I think Alder Vafadar, you summed up the statement very well, in that we're not seeking direction to go ahead and get an IGA in place and that we're going to be an active participant. Does that make sense, or does some other option make sense, or does just leaving it status quo make the most sense? So that's certainly what we'll work on if the council is comfortable with it. And it sounds like the majority of the council is comfortable with us at least spending some time on it to shake out a few more details.
Great. Well, thank you for the great conversation, everyone. I think we can go ahead and move on to announcements. Our next committee of the whole meeting is on July 24th, 2024. The current plan, and I believe this is pretty solid, we're going to do a municipal budgeting presentation from Misty, which is done annually and will be really interesting as always. And then Olivia Perry from Dane County has agreed to do a presentation on the regional housing strategy. So if you all have specific requests about what that should include, I'm having a conversation with Olivia about what the scope of that conversation could be. So if you have specific things related to the housing plan that you want to see, would be welcome to suggestions. And I'm also going to probably send out some information in advance. I think it would be worthwhile if all of us took some time to at least read through the executive summary of the housing plan or through the whole thing, just so we have some background context going into the conversation and can start the conversation at a higher level. So I'll be sending information out about that, but feel free to send me feedback. I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor of adjourning, say aye.
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 Motion carries. We are adjourned at 9 p.m.